Well, hi, everybody. Welcome to Inside Policy Talks, the in house podcast of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. I'm Aaron Wudrick, the director of MLI's domestic policy program. And today I'm very pleased to be joined by Dr. Kevin Bardosh, the director and head of research at Collateral Global, to talk about his organization and its central mission of researching, understanding, and communicating the effectiveness and collateral impacts of measures taken by governments worldwide in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. That's a mouthful, but I'm sure Kevin will break it down for us. Kevin, thanks so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on, Aaron.
So maybe Kevin, we can start a bit about you, what your personal background is, and how you became. How did you come to be a part of this endeavor, Collateral Global?
Yeah, so I'm a medical anthropologist, and I've worked on infectious disease control programs around the world for 15 years. So Africa, Asia, and elsewhere. I've also been involved in epidemic response, so particularly with the Zika pandemic in Latin America. I led a large program in Haiti during that time, and also the Ebola response in West Africa, and also the Democratic Republic of Congo. And during that time, there's a large conversation about integrating social scientists in epidemic and pandemic response. And so I was involved in a number of large projects trying to do that with WHO, UNICEF, and other international organizations during sort of pre-COVID times. And then when COVID happened, it felt like a lot of those lessons about not disrupting society and building trust and not having heavy-handed mandates and sort of emergency laws, that approach was sort of thrown out the window. And what we saw emerge was this biomedical model, borrowing metaphors, but also actual strategies from the military. That's always been part of public health, but we really saw it ramp up during COVID. And
Mm,
periodically during the sort of two plus years of the pandemic, I kept on thinking things were going to go back to normal, but they actually kept on getting worse. And it was really when the COVID vaccine mandates took off in North America that I wrote a couple of papers that became quite well known against the mandates. And then I did a review for Collateral Global on the harms of lockdowns around the world, on everything from psychological impacts, business impacts, health impacts, etc. And through that work, we've kind of grown to the place that we are right now. And I can just that kind of dovetails into the story of Collateral
yeah.
Global itself, which has an interesting history. So many of you might have heard of the Great Barrington Declaration that was signed in October of 2020 by Sunetra Gupta and Jay Bhattacharya and Martin Kulldorff. Jay and Sunetra then founded Collateral Global a month later. And as you mentioned, the emphasis of the organization is on researching the impact of COVID policies. So in the GBD, there's a number of assumptions or kind of statements or claims made about the negative impacts of lockdown. And so as a research organization, our focus is on bringing scholarly research to bear on that topic of harm. And what we've seen is actually over the last couple of years is just there's an astronomical amount of academic research on the negative impacts of lockdown, but all the other sort of non-pharmaceutical interventions that were rolled out during COVID. And so it's our emphasis to bring that to the public, to the academic community, media, legal community, and others.
Okay. And to go back a bit, I mean, you mentioned the Great Barrington Declaration. It's probably worth clarifying really what that was about for people. Some people say,
Yeah.
well, it's this terrible. Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, is my understanding is that it was essentially a view that rather than impose sort of society-wide measures, the measures that should be taken should be focused on the most vulnerable, the people who are greatest risk, and minimizing the sort of whole of society measures. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, exactly. It is. And in fact, I would say that was the pre 2020 general consensus in the public health community.
Right.
I mean, if you look at the document that the WHO produced in late 2019 on pandemic influenza, they list NPIs. And in there, they say, for example, contact tracing should not be done at any time. Any school closures should be very short lived, if at all. Lockdown was not on the table at all, in the least. And so I would say the GBD, in many respects, reflected that consensus pre-COVID. But then we've had this whole politicization of science,
Right.
and of course, fear and panic does all sorts of things to people. And it's just bizarre that the GBD itself, as a document, was pegged as this right-wing conspiracy theory. Actually, that term was thrown around on
Right.
it for a long time. I mean, it's nothing of the sort at all.
So in other words, that you're saying that the GBD was essentially just conventional wisdom until the pandemic hit, and then suddenly all the rules changed, and the GBD was framed as this sort of radical departure from the consensus.
Yes, it was.
Hmm.
And simply because it was hosted by an American conservative organization that wasn't involved in drafting it, they just provided the venue.
Right.
Um, and it was a very convenient way to dismiss this position. And we have now through freedom of information requests, emails from Fauci and others saying, hey, we have to bring down these people, right?
Yeah.
And it was a concerted media effort to discredit these scientists.
Yeah, very troubling. I mean, we could talk a bit about how Collateral Global is advancing the goals because it sounds to me like this is just a matter of measuring trade-offs, right? We went through a lot of sort of once in a lifetime exercises. Looking back now, sometimes it's hard to believe the scale and scope of some of them. But at the time, anyone who sort of raised their hand is saying, "Okay, well, I see what you're trying to achieve, but there's a trade-off here," and people didn't want to talk about that. So,
Yeah.
is it really about trying to better understand? The effectiveness of a lot of these measures, if there might have been a better way to do them, and whether in many cases they were worth it or not.
Yeah, no, exactly. That's it. So we have a couple of different main pillars that we focus on. One is on the effectiveness of COVID policies themselves
Mm.
on disease transmission, and then we also focus on the harms of these policies or the societal impacts of these policies. And
Sure.
there's research suggesting some positive impacts. For example, if you were in a wealthier income bracket, you got to spend a lot more time with your kids.
Sure.
You got to experience what homeschooling was like, et cetera. So we can't just brush.
Remote work for some people in terms of like shift. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean it's a complicated, like the whole world sort of paused and underwent this reshuffling. And but in general, the harms, in my opinion, having really dove into the research, really do outpace the positives for disease control and then also any societal benefits.
Yeah.
Um,
Maybe
yeah.
talk a bit about some of those. I'm guessing education, mental health, obviously economic. Is there anything I'm missing that sort of when we talk about trade-offs, we talk about the people that were very upset about the measures, warning about it. Is there anything else that leaps to mind?
I mean, I'll bring up one case, and this was just a study I saw just the other day, estimating that the recession, the global recession caused by lockdown, is responsible for over 500,000 deaths in Africa, including 150,000 children. And now that vastly outweighs any COVID deaths in Africa, which is epidemiologically really fascinating. How the continent that global people in global health predicted would see the largest mortality from COVID actually saw very, very little.
Right.
And if you look at, for example, poverty rates, these are from the World Bank figures that estimate 400 million people dropped below their national poverty line in 2020, and that hadn't recovered by 2023. So,
Yeah.
we know that poverty has all sorts of long-term health consequences on families, and that's just one endpoint. You want to pick education impacts. There was a recent report by the OCDC, a European-based or French-based research think tank that estimates the current generation of kids might lose up to $1 or $2 trillion in earnings over their lifetime because of the school closure impacts. I mean, I could go on, and a lot of this data is available on our website where we've really dived in there. And it's hard for people to get their heads around just how many different types of impacts there are, and the scale of harm.
Yeah.
So that's one of the things that we really are focused on, is enlarging people's imagination in that regard. Um,
And it's important that we take a global view of this because, as you say, I mean, you mentioned Africa. When we talk about the impacts in sort of wealthy countries like Canada, a lot of people pointed to the fact, governments could provide temporary support or resources, right? Or that it's a
yes,
different, it's a lot different for if you have a household income of $100,000, you can
right,
afford to take a dent for 20 or 30% for a little while. But if your household income is a tiny fraction of that, and losing that, it becomes a subsistence issue, which is why I presume
yeah,
places like Africa suffer, dramatically from similar measures.
yes. But even in Canada and wealthy countries, I mean, we saw astronomical debt accumulation
Mm.
because of these furlough schemes and business retention schemes. The studies actually on the effectiveness of them, many of them show that they were not very effective. They were not delivered to firms or to households that really needed them. And they have all sorts of downstream economic impacts as well. So
Right.
it's this assumption that we can just pay people to stay home. It's very problematic from an economic standpoint.
Yeah, no argument there. I want to talk a bit, if you don't mind, about a piece you published through MLI that called for a full inquiry into the COVID response. I guess I wanted to get your thoughts on what you think the odds of that actually happening are, and there's been a few efforts in Canada and Alberta, for example, sort
Mm.
of I think like a people's inquiry. Any thoughts on those sorts of things, and whether I guess whether you see any realistic prospect of a major inquiry happening here in Canada?
Yeah. So I think public inquiries are important. They can serve a very important function in holding decision makers to account. I've followed the UK COVID inquiry quite closely for an online British newspaper called Unheard. And this started in June of 2023. And it's quite a large public inquiry. In fact, it's going to be the most expensive in British history, estimated to cost up to 3 or 400 million pounds by 2026. It's an independent inquiry. And there's a fundamental problem with this inquiry, which is that it takes the assumptions of COVID scientists, so scientists who advise the government on COVID measures, and assumes that these are true. That lockdowns, for example, stopped infections, that they were necessary, that mask mandates were necessary, that school closures were necessary, and so they take these as axiomatic. And when you do that, you're not actually really shining a hard light onto how these
Right.
decisions were made and whether they were justified. So in my piece that I published with MLI, I'm saying if Canada does need a COVID inquiry, but when it hopefully comes, it needs to take those assumptions, right, and flip them on their head. I mean, that's the whole
Yeah.
function of the public inquiry. Was the government correct in its policy choices, right?
Sure.
And there's a problem there, which is this, and this actually reflects on my community, global public health or public health. A lot of the scientists that will testify at that inquiry, and this is what happened in the UK, are the ones who were responsible for recommending them. So you can't have the same scientists who recommended lockdown then be called upon to evaluate lockdown, right?
Sure. Sure.
It's just fundamentally a
Bit
conflict
of
of
interesting.
right.
Yeah.
So, and this is what we're seeing around the world. And in fact, Canada has supposedly, in great secrecy, brought a British scientist called Sir Mark Walport, and he led a Royal Society commission in the UK looking at the impact of COVID measures. And the Liberal government has supposedly brought him to chair an evaluation in Canada, but there's no public announcement about this. In fact, Conservative MPs in Parliament had to ask the Liberals in one of the sessions whether this was true. It was rumors, and it's now come out that yes, he's been brought to chair an evaluation in Canada, but nobody knows who's on the evaluation committee. And supposedly they're coming out with some sort of document in a couple of months. And
Sure.
this is just not very helpful for accountability and transparency.
Right, right. And I mean, let's be clear, it's not just about holding people to account. It's about learning important lessons that we want to know for the future, right? So I can appreciate how any government that was in power during COVID is going to be reluctant to, do a full open kimono on
Right.
their decision making. But I mean, if you think about this going forward, it'd be very, very useful to know whether
Yeah.
these things are effective or not, so that we can be ready for the next time something similar happens. Hopefully, not too soon, though.
Yeah. Yeah. No, when I say accountability, that's what I mean. I
Mm.
mean accountability for the policy decisions themselves. So,
Yeah, fair enough. Um, and what do you, I mean, do you have any thoughts on there's been a few sort of smaller efforts here in Canada. We saw one in Alberta.
yeah.
I mean, these are probably not at the scale that you're thinking of, but do you see and do you see any interest out there from sort of across the political spectrum, or is this going to be something that once again is just framed as, well, it's just disgruntled right wingers and people who weren't in power that are just trying to score political points against the government of the day?
Right. Well, so taking the last question first, that's a misperception. So people who
Mm.
actually are do have skepticism about the mainstream policy decisions that were made are not right or left. They cut across the spectrum, and often they're the people who just want to bring critical reasoning and debate to these large, unprecedented decisions that were made across our country, right?
Right.
And that's an unfortunate sort of narrative that's taken off. In terms of efforts in Canada, I mean, the National Citizens Inquiry, right? They were sort of an independent public inquiry. They visited 7 cities around the country, had hundreds of witnesses. They've produced a report, and all of the testimony is available online. No mainstream Canadian newspaper covered this, and so I'm not really sure what the impact going
Right.
forward is. Um, our efforts at Collateral Global are focused on the academic community in many regards, right? We want to systematically review the evidence that's been published in Canada and critically inspect the assumptions and the parameters that are used in those studies as well. And I think that that's something that the Public Health Agency of Canada needs to be involved in, right? Or you would think that they would be involved in. The Canadian Institutes for Health Research, SSHRC, and a lot of the other academic funding bodies in Canada. And I do think that they need to be more receptive to fund research that's critical, and seriously investigates the
Right.
impact of policy decisions.
Right, right. One last question here before we tie it up, but I wanted to ask if there are any good global examples that you've seen or that you would propose as a template for Canada. I know you mentioned the one in the UK. It doesn't sound like, given
Yeah.
the what they're taking as action, but have you had any success anywhere? Or do you see any promising signs anywhere that any government is going to take you up on?
That's a great question. So we're just starting to launch so we're launching a series of country working groups. So
Uh,
UK, Canada, US, but also Italy, Germany, Ireland, India, South Africa, lots of different countries around the world. And so I guess I can have an update for you in a couple months.
Early days.
Yeah, it's early days here. And yeah, I think there's a lot of interest though, and we'll see what impact we have going forward.
Well, I think it's a very important initiative, and hats off to you for pursuing it. I think perhaps optimistically, the further we get away from the pandemic itself, the more openness there may be as people sort of reflect on what a unprecedented period it was. So, thank you so much. This is Kevin talking with Kevin Bardosh, director and head of research at Collateral Global. Kevin, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you all for tuning in to MLI Inside Policy Talks.